Alright, this is study 16 of our study in the letter to the Philippians. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 4, verse 6 to verse 9. Before we do that, we'll answer the questions for chapter 4, verse 1 to 5. The first question, well, all the questions really is basically how do we live in light of the fact that Jesus Christ is coming again, that he's working in us and that we're his people and that we want to be more like him. How do we live in light of those things? And the first one was to look at verse 1 and to see that. And the answer is this: we stand fast or we stand firm. And that's the same thing that was said in chapter 1, verse 27 to 28. So what you're going to notice here in verse 1 to 5 is Paul is basically summarizing everything he said so far. So stand fast, stand firm, as he said already in chapter 1, verse 27 to 28. To stand fast against false teaching, to stand fast against persecution, to stand fast against division. And we do this in, through, and for Christ and his gospel. The second question was how to live like it's true from verse 2 to verse 3, and that is unity. There were two women who were having problems within the church, and Paul encourages them and the people around them to help with the unity and bring them together to be of the same mind. Now again, this is a theme that Paul's already touched on in Philippians. He's looked at it in chapter 1, verse 27, and in chapter 2, verse 1 to 4. So, humble, selfless unity, again, in, through, and for Christ and his gospel. The third one was how to live like this is true in verse 4 to verse 5. And that is joy and gentleness. And again, Paul has already been looking at this in chapter 2, verse 1 to 4 and verse 14. Not murmuring, not dividing, not complaining, but rather being content and patient in, through, and for Christ and his gospel. Now again, all of this is possible through the gospel, chapter 1 verse 6, chapter 1 verse 9 to 11, and chapter 2 verse 13. And it's our responsibility to cultivate that work, to work out our salvation, chapter 2 verse 12. Now we come to chapter 4, verse 6 to 9, and we're looking at these questions. And Paul has been dealing with three big issues so far in the letter to the Philippians. He's dealt with the idea of persecution and imprisonment in chapter 1. In chapter 2, it's about broken relationships and conflict and how to fix those in chapter 2. And chapter 3 has been about false gospels and false teachers. The answer to all of these is the same: knowing Jesus and his gospel and growing in love through that knowledge. Chapter 1, verse 9 to 11. Now Paul seems to be introducing a new theme, another issue that Christians will face, and that is the cares of this world with all of its worries and problems. Now, reading about Paul being in prison, potentially facing death, and not being overly concerned or worried about that is challenging to me. I've been worried over far less, and if you're honest, I'm sure that you have as well. Some say, oh, it's just my nature, I'm a worrier. That's actually quite an accurate statement, because at the bottom of it, our nature is that we are sinners who want to be independent from God instead of trusting him and relying on him. So it's actually true, it is our nature, but it's a part of our sinful nature. When we're enslaved to worry, we end up only thinking about ourselves again. If you think about it, when you're worrying, you're making it all about you again. And that's the opposite of what Paul's been commanding in this letter here. Paul is saying we can be free from worry, so that then we can concern ourselves with Christ and serving others instead. So the question is, how can I enter into this experience of not being worried and instead have peace? Well, that's what verse 6 to 9 of chapter 4 is about. So here's the questions. Question 1, instead of worrying, what should I do according to verse 6? And question 2, what is the promise if I do this in verse 7? So verse 6 and 7, there's something I need to do in order to have this thing. So what are those two things? Instead of worrying, what should I do? Verse 6. And what is the promise if I do this? Verse 7. Third question, instead of worrying, what should I do according to verse 8 to 9? And the fourth question, what is the promise if I do this according to verse 9? So you can see there's a theme here. There's something I need to do, and there's a promise in verse 6 to 7. There's something I need to do, and there's a promise in verse 8 to 9. And your job, your study this time, is to figure out what those things are. And I really think it will be a blessing, especially in light of all that we're going through at the moment, to meditate on these verses and to realize the beautiful promises that are in them. God bless.